I want you to picture something. You're standing in a field just outside Flint, Michigan. A couple of years ago, politicians stood here promising something extraordinary. They talked about thousands of jobs, billions of dollars in investment, a manufacturing comeback, a chance to put Genesee County back on the map. They said this wasn't just another factory, it was part of America's future. Semiconductors, the tiny chips that power your phone, your car, your computer, even much of our military equipment. The kind of industry every state in the country wanted. Fast forward to today. There isn't a semiconductor factory here. There aren't thousands of new workers clocking in every morning. The company everyone expected to build here walked away. But one thing didn't disappear: the taxpayer's investment. Before we jump into today's episode, I want to say something that's a little different from some of our previous discussions. Today we're talking about a specific public project, specific public officials, and a specific company. That comes with a responsibility. Everything you're about to hear is based on publicly available reporting, government documents, official statements, and the best information I could verify. Like any major story, some details evolve over time, and different sources occasionally report different numbers. When that happens, I'll tell you. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. In fact, I don't want you to. I'll be publishing the research and sources used for this episode on the Max Delta Hour website so you can read them yourself. If I missed something, tell me. If new information comes out, I'll update the record. Because the goal isn't to win an argument, it's to understand what happened. And I think I owe you that much. I'm Max Delta, and this is the Max Delta Hour. Semiconductors are one of those things most people never think about until they can't get them. They're in your phone, your truck, your laptop, your refrigerator, your kid's game console, your Ring camera, your medical devices, your military systems. And during COVID, when supply chains started snapping like cheap lawn chairs, America got a painful reminder that we don't control nearly as much of that supply chain as we probably should. That's why the semiconductor race became such a big deal. It wasn't just tech companies chasing money. It became national security. It became manufacturing policy. It became jobs. And for states like Michigan, it became a chance to say, hey, we build things here. We know manufacturing. We know cars. We know supply chains. Why shouldn't the next generation of advanced manufacturing happen here? And honestly, that argument makes sense. Michigan should compete. Flint and Genesee County especially needed a win. This is an area that knows what it feels like when industry leaves. People there have watched factories close, jobs disappear, neighborhoods decline, and politicians make big promises that don't always turn into real life. So when the idea of a massive advanced manufacturing site near Mundy Township started taking shape, you can understand why supporters saw it as a once-in-a-generation opportunity. This wasn't being pitched as a warehouse. This wasn't a small industrial park. This was supposed to be big. Really big. Reporting tied the project to SanDisk, and the possible investment was reported somewhere between $55 and $63 billion. That's billion with a B. The job numbers also vary depending on the report, but we're talking roughly 9,400 to 10,000 jobs in some of the public reporting. That kind of project changes a region, if it works. And that's the key phrase, if it works. Because the whole idea behind these megasites is that you prepare the land before the company fully commits. You assemble the parcels, you clear legal and zoning obstacles, you make sure utilities, roads, drainage, and infrastructure can support a massive industrial project. You try to make the site shovel-ready, because if a company is comparing Michigan against Ohio, Texas, Arizona, Indiana, Tennessee, or anywhere else, you don't want to be the state saying, yeah, give us 5 years and maybe we can get the land figured out. That's the supporter argument. And it's not stupid. It's not crazy. It's not automatically corrupt. It's how states compete now. But here's where the tension starts. To make the site ready, taxpayers had to put real money on the table before the public had the full picture. And once public money goes in, the question changes. It's no longer just, can Michigan land the big project? It becomes, what exactly are taxpayers buying? Because hope is not an economic development strategy. So, what exactly did Michigan buy? That's a simple question with a surprisingly complicated answer. One thing I want to be careful about throughout this episode is the language we use. You'll hear people say Michigan spent $260 million. Others will say the state approved $260 million. Others use the word committed. Those aren't always the same thing. Based on the reporting and the public documents we reviewed, Michigan approved roughly $250 million through various site readiness programs to prepare what became known as the Advanced Manufacturing District of Genesee County. That money wasn't for building a semiconductor factory. The factory never existed. Instead, the money was used to prepare the site that supporters hoped would eventually attract one. That meant buying land, acquiring properties, planning infrastructure, preparing roads, improving drainage, removing obstacles that would make a company think twice about building there. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to sell your house. You mow the lawn, paint the walls, replace the old carpet, fix the broken fence. You haven't sold the house yet. You're investing money in the hope that someone will buy it. Michigan was essentially trying to do the same thing, just on a scale measured in hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. And that's where the debate really begins. Supporters looked at the investment and said, this is exactly what states have to do if they want to compete. Because here's the reality. Michigan wasn't competing against an empty field. It was competing against Ohio, Texas, Arizona, Indiana, Tennessee, states that were also preparing massive industrial sites and offering incentives to attract advanced manufacturing. If Michigan showed up empty-handed, supporters argued, the company would simply go somewhere else. And there is some truth to that. Large manufacturers don't usually wait years while governments negotiate land purchases and utility upgrades. They want sites that are ready to build. But critics looked at the exact same investment and asked a different question. What happens if the company never comes? That's the risk with every speculative investment. Sometimes it pays off, sometimes it doesn't. And unlike a private investor risking their own money, government is risking taxpayer money, your money, my money, which means the public has every right to ask hard questions before, during, and after those decisions are made. That doesn't automatically mean the investment was wrong. It does mean accountability matters. Because once public money is committed, the public deserves to know what they're buying. And that's where this story starts becoming less about economics and more about transparency. Up until this point, we've mostly been talking about numbers. Millions of dollars, thousands of jobs, hundreds of acres. But for the people who lived in and around Mundy Township, this wasn't an economic development strategy. It was their neighborhood, their homes, their lives. As planning for the megasite moved forward, reports began describing a process that many residents felt they weren't fully part of. Some local officials were operating under non-disclosure agreements during negotiations. Supporters argued those agreements were necessary. If you're competing against other states for a multi-billion-dollar investment, companies don't necessarily want every detail negotiated in public. That's how these deals often work. Critics saw it differently. They argued that taxpayer-funded projects should come with taxpayer transparency. After all, this wasn't private money. This was public money, and the public wanted answers. Residents began asking questions. Which homes might be purchased? Which properties could eventually be demolished? How much land was really needed? What company was coming? How much would taxpayers ultimately be responsible for? In many cases, those answers weren't immediately available. Bridge, Michigan reported that roughly 165 homes were expected to be acquired or demolished as part of the broader development. For some families, this wasn't a policy debate. It was the possibility of losing the place they'd called home for years. Now, it's important to recognize something. None of this automatically means anyone acted with bad intentions. Supporters believed they were trying to secure one of the largest economic development projects in Michigan's history. Critics believed the public deserved more information before so much money and property were committed. Those two ideas can both exist at the same time. And maybe that's the biggest lesson here. Transparency isn't just about catching wrongdoing. It's about building trust. Because when people understand what's happening, even if they disagree, they're far more likely to believe the process was fair. When they don't, questions fill the silence. And once trust begins to disappear, it's incredibly difficult to get it back. Then, everything changed. After years of planning, years of negotiations, years of preparing the site, the project everyone had been watching suddenly hit a wall. In July of 2025, reports confirmed that SanDisk would not be moving forward with the proposed semiconductor project in Mundy Township. The company wasn't just walking away from Michigan. According to state officials, it had decided not to move forward with building a semiconductor fabrication plant anywhere in the United States. Governor Gretchen Whitmer pointed to national economic uncertainty as a major factor behind the decision. Others disagreed with that explanation. Some argued that tariffs and federal policy should have made domestic manufacturing even more attractive. Others believed changing market conditions, financing costs, and the enormous expense of building a modern semiconductor fabrication plant ultimately made the project too risky. The truth is, we don't know every conversation that happened behind closed doors. And we shouldn't pretend that we do. What we do know is this: the anchor project was gone. The factory wasn't coming. The thousands of expected jobs weren't coming. And the question that had been sitting quietly in the background suddenly moved to the front of the conversation. Now what? The land was still there. Much of the preparation work had already been completed or funded. The state maintained that the advanced manufacturing district could still attract another major employer in the future. Supporters argued that the investment hadn't disappeared. It had created a site that could still compete for future projects. Critics looked at the same situation and saw something very different. They saw hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars committed without the project that justified those investments ever materializing. Who's right? Honestly, history hasn't answered that question yet. If another major manufacturer eventually builds on that site, people may look back and say Michigan made the right long-term investment. If the land sits unused for years, people will almost certainly ask why so much public money was committed before a final deal was in place. That's why I think this story is so interesting. We're living through it. This isn't a history lesson. The final chapter hasn't been written. And that means the lesson isn't about pretending we already know how this ends. It's about asking whether the process itself gave taxpayers the transparency and accountability they deserved along the way. So, what should we actually take away from all of this? I don't think the lesson is that government should never offer incentives. If that were true, no state would ever attract a major employer. The reality is that almost every state in America competes for these projects. Sometimes they compete with tax incentives. Sometimes they compete with infrastructure. Sometimes they compete with land. Sometimes they compete with all three. Michigan isn't unique. But I do think this project raises some important questions. How much risk should taxpayers be expected to carry? At what point should negotiations become public? What level of transparency should citizens expect when hundreds of millions of public dollars are involved? And perhaps the biggest question of all, how do we measure success? Is success landing one company? Is success preparing a site that might attract several companies over the next 20 years? Or is success making sure taxpayers fully understand the risks before the first dollar is committed? Reasonable people can disagree on those answers. But they should at least be able to agree on one thing. Public trust matters. Whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, or someone who's completely tired of politics altogether, government works best when people understand what their money is being used for. Transparency isn't a partisan value. It's a public value. And accountability isn't something that only matters when your political opponents are in office. It should matter all the time. Maybe another manufacturer eventually builds on this site. I genuinely hope one does. If thousands of good-paying jobs come to Genesee County because of the work that's already been done, that would be a great outcome for Michigan. But if that happens, it doesn't erase the questions people asked along the way. And if it never happens, those questions become even more important. This story isn't really about one company. It isn't really about one governor. It's about the relationship between government and the people it serves. If taxpayers are asked to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in the future of their state, they deserve to understand both the opportunity and the risk. Because democracy isn't built on blind trust. It's built on informed citizens. And informed citizens ask questions, not because they want government to fail, but because they want it to succeed. That's going to do it for today's episode. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this, it's that asking questions doesn't make someone anti-business, and it doesn't make someone anti-government. It makes them an informed citizen. Michigan may still attract another major manufacturer to this site. I sincerely hope it does. Thousands of good-paying jobs would be a win for Genesee County, for Michigan, and for everyone who calls this state home. But no matter how this story ends, the questions we asked today still matter. Because public trust is earned through transparency and accountability, not assumptions. If you'd like to read the documents, news articles, and public records used while researching today's episode, they're available on the Max Delta Hour website. I encourage you to read them for yourself. If I got something wrong, tell me. If new information comes out, I'll update the record. Because the goal isn't to defend a narrative, it's to follow the facts wherever they lead. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed, shared it with someone who enjoys thoughtful conversations, or left a comment below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Thanks for spending part of your day with me. I'm Max Delta. This has been the Max Delta Hour. Until next time, stay curious.